Welcome to the Foster in Palo Alto, California. We are a unique museum dedicated to sharing the watercolor journeys of artist-explorer Tony Foster. We hope to inspire reflection, discussion, and education about art, wilderness, and the natural world. With this series of 4 videos, we invite you on a tour of the museum with the artist-explorer himself. Please join Tony on the second of the series, Exploring Beauty, Watercolor Diaries from the Wild.
Welcome everybody. I would like to take you around to see my exhibition Exploring Beauty, which is all about some of nature's most wonderful places in the planet that we all inhabit together. This exhibition really, I suppose, has been in the back of my mind for 30 odd years, more than 30 actually, probably nearer 40 years. I was trying to find a gallery in New York that would represent my work about 38 years ago, and I contacted or went to a gallery called Ronald Feldman, which was at the time a very important, it still is I think, a very important contemporary gallery down in Soho. And Ronald Feldman looked at my work and said, yes, I'm quite interested in this. He said, do you mind if I take some home for the weekend to my place out on the Cape to think about it? So I said, no, take some stuff and see what you think. So off he went, and he said, I'll see you on Tuesday. So I went back on Tuesday, and I said, so what do you think? And he said, well, I really like your work. He said, I've enjoyed looking at it over the weekend, and it's been really nice to have it around. But I've got to tell you, I can't represent you because your work is just too beautiful. And I thought, well, that's a really weird thing. Or when did producing work that was beautiful become a mark against an artist rather than a mark in his favor? And so anyway, I thought that I'd been thinking no more about it until when I looked back after working in the backcountry now and in wilderness areas for 30 odd years. I looked back and I thought, actually, when I look back on all this stuff, what I have evoked in a lot of these places is the beauty of them, even places you wouldn't think would naturally be beautiful, like deserts. I would find something beautiful about them, and I would try and convey that. And so I thought perhaps what I should do now, it's time I came out of the closet and confessed to the fact that what I've been trying to do all this time is to make work of beauty. And so I thought, well, what I'll do now is, how am I going to decide where I'm going to go to? Because am I the person who should actually be the one who decides what's the most beautiful place in the world? And I thought, no, I haven't gained that kind of stature. But what I'll do is I'll talk to people who spend a lot of time in wild places, in the backcountry, exploring and climbing, and geologists, people who spend a lot of time naturally working in these places. And I would ask them to nominate what they thought was the most beautiful wild place they'd ever seen. And then my part in it would then be to go to that place and see if I could find out what it was they thought was so beautiful and make work about it. And their part in the contract would be that they would write an essay or write a few paragraphs or even just write a few sentences about why they thought that was the most beautiful thing in the world. So I asked all sorts of people like David Attenborough and our great British climber, Stephen Venables, mountain climber, explorers, geologists, biologists, all sorts of people, astronomers, people who are used to looking closely at wild nature, asked them for their nominations, and they all took it very seriously. They all nominated the places they thought were the most beautiful and wrote pieces about it in the catalogue. So, and I suppose this was Foster coming out of the closet and saying, that there is something to be said, even in contemporary art, there's something to be said about beauty. And so that's what this exhibition is about. So we'll start actually, having asked all my luminaries, people I called my luminaries, having asked them all what's the most beautiful place in the world, I thought, well, if I'm going to spend 3 or 4 years wandering around the world doing these paintings, the very least I could do, I suppose, is be able to nominate one place myself. And so the place I nominated, of course, was places I could walk to out of my own back door in Cornwall. I live in a village called Tywardreath in Cornwall. Cornwall's very, very beautiful, and and I thought I can walk out of my own back door to all sorts of places I know are absolutely exquisite, and so I'm going to do a few paintings about that as my contribution to my own show. So these here are all within walking distance of my home. I'll draw your attention. This is Arrowhead, and it's along the cliffs from where I live. This little row of souvenirs here, these are periwinkle shells, and there's one beach on the way to this headland here. There's one beach where I know I can find periwinkle shells of all these colors. And I don't know why they all come out a different color. It must be, I don't know what the minerals they eat, or who knows what it is. But anyway, I can go all the way from yellowy white all the way through to almost a purpley black. So I made this lovely color combination, which went like a necklace, really. And that too, natural things that one finds are just naturally beautiful. And so that's Arrowhead, a place where my wife and I often sit there and have a picnic and read a book, and it's very beautiful. This too, a similar thing here, also on the way to that, a little sketch that I did of a little beach just close by, just the natural rocks and cliffs and a beautiful ocean. This one, in a way, has got a bit more to it because this is a place called the Luxillian Valley, another favourite place. The thing about the Luxillian Valley, which is, I suppose, rather hopeful, is that at one time, or for many 200 or 300 years, it must have been a scene of absolute devastation because it was heavily mined for all sorts of different minerals and also for granite, and it had a railway track through it where they used to take all the minerals and the rocks and things down to the local harbour. It had huge water wheels, it had stamps for stamping the ore, it had enormous drying houses for drying out china clay, which was something else they extracted. And so it must have been a scene of hell on earth at one time, but because eventually the bottom fell out of the market for most of the things that were being extracted from there, it was just left alone. And it's been left alone now for 150 years. And what happens is, luckily for us, is that nature takes it back. And this is the bluebells in the Luxillian Valley and the beautiful beech trees. And there's a certain time of the year when the bluebells come out and the beech trees are just coming into leaf, when there's almost a dazzling contrast between those two colors. And I tried to evoke that in the painting. And along here at the bottom here are all the things that were mined in the Luxillian Valley. So there's granite, there's tin, there's copper, there's china clay. That's china clay there. And this is a little tin ingot made by somebody who is still streaming tin in the little stream at the bottom of the valley. And he made that ingot for me to put into my painting. But I suppose that's to prove that if we leave nature alone, it will actually reassert itself. This too is another place which is one of my favourite places. This is the marsh just below my house. It's called Tywardreath Marsh. It's a small area of, I don't know how many acres, but very small. We don't really have wilderness in Europe, but what we do have is little places like this, which are just left alone. And nature just is rampant and takes it over, and that's that. And this too used to be farmed actually as fields at one time, but when they closed the mines down, the river, or a little stream, reasserted itself and turned it into a marshland. And in fact, very often when I was going to go and work in the rainforest, I would go into Tywardreath Marsh and do some painting just to get reacquainted with the idea of how you paint pictures which are just nothing but trees and leaves and nothing much else, which if you're not careful could become like wallpaper. So that's what that's about. And then this little painting here is something I was doing actually on the way back from the Luxillian Valley, and Cornish hedges in May are just the most glorious things you'll ever see in your life. Just wildflowers bursting out of hedges, which in very narrow lanes. So you have wildflowers coming out both sides, and they're just exquisite. And so that's just a little study I did on the way back from painting the Luxillian Valley. Over here we've got a painting of Greenland, And this was nominated by Carrie Herbert, who is the daughter of Sir Wally Herbert, who was one of Britain's great Arctic explorers, and I believe the first man to solo across the North Pole from one side to the other. Wally Herbert took his family, to his wife and daughter Carrie, to live with the Inuit up in northern Greenland, and they lived there I think for about 3 years, when Carrie was from the ages of 2 or 3 to 5 or 6. And so when I spoke to her, she said, of course, she could only nominate the icebergs in northern Greenland. So I went up to northern Greenland and did this painting here. Interestingly, my next door neighbor at the time, who was an old lady called Joy, and I just finished that painting, and I said to her, "Hey Joy, come and see what I've been doing." So she came up to my studio and she looked at it, and she burst into tears when she saw it. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I know you'll think I'm just a stupid old woman." She said, "But I didn't realize there was anywhere so beautiful in our world." And I thought, wow, that's really hit exactly the tone I want to find with my exhibition. This iceberg here, these icebergs are huge. It's hard to get a sense of the scale of them because there's nothing to compare them with, except if you look here, there's a tiny little fishing boat. Well, the fishing boat isn't tiny, the iceberg is big, but you get a sense of the scale there when you spot how tiny this little boat looks. And this iceberg here suddenly turned over, and they're enormous things, and it caused a tidal wave which came up to the shore just under where we were camping and washed away lots of boulders, and there was a big rumbling and bubbling as this thing washed out an enormous area. And we went down to see what had happened, and we found the remains of an Inuit settlement. Not much to be found there except all these little bits and pieces of things like stone tools, stone points, seal bones, seal's teeth, little bits of pottery, tiny bit of glass, some glass beads, a crystal bead, more glass beads here, and a little knife blade, a nail, and some arrow points, metal arrow points. And they're obviously quite ancient because it starts with stone tools. But the most interesting thing in a way to me was those little tiny pieces of 18th century Chinese porcelain. And I thought, what on earth was Chinese porcelain doing up in northern Greenland? It's just inconceivable to me and almost impossible to explain. But anyway, and so I did these studies of what I'd found, and then I collected them all together and gave them to the local school teacher who was running a little school, and said you've got to keep these things because this is your history. And then this thing here is obviously a piece of melted iceberg. It was a piece of frozen iceberg, but unfortunately it's too warm to keep it frozen here, so we had to. And this is Denali, nominated by my dear friend Professor Winslow Briggs, who was the director of the director of the Carnegie Institute of Plant Biology at Stanford. He died a few weeks ago, and I miss him dearly. A super person and a brilliant scientist. And he and I traveled together a lot. And I was expecting, because he was a plant biologist, I thought he'd nominate somewhere with biology in it, somewhere like a rainforest or something associated with plants. But in fact, he nominated Denali in Alaska. And I said, "Why did you nominate that, Winslow?" And he said, "Well, because I climbed Denali when I was in the Harvard Climbing Club in 1949. And he said, and we summited the next summit to Denali, which had never been summited before. He said it was an extraordinary experience. And then on the way down, I had somebody on belay, and he was coming down an ice slope, and I was kind of locked into the ice slope, and he was coming down, and he slipped and fell and went rocketing past me and dragged me off with the rope that was connecting us, and both of us went rocketing down this ice slope. And he said, I managed to turn around and do a classic ice axe arrest, dig the ice axe in and lie on it to keep it down. And he said he managed to stop the other guy within inches of falling over an enormous precipice. And he said, that's as near to death as I've ever come. I've never forgotten it, and I look back on it as one of the great experiences of my life. And so he nominated Denali, and I went off to paint it. And the interesting thing for me about this was, when I was talking to the rangers, I got quite friendly with the rangers in the end. They were a little touch and go at first, but eventually they saw I was serious, and they became quite interested and helpful. And they said, well, will you show us what you've been doing when you finish? So I said, okay. And so I went to see them and laid it out on the floor of their cabin. About 6 rangers had assembled to see this thing. And they said, well, do you know where you were? And I said, well, yeah, of course I know where I was. Here, on the map, here it is. This is where I was sitting. And they said, no, but do you know what it's called? And I said, well, it's not called anything on the map. And they said, no, but that is Ansel Adams Point. And I said, is it? Why? And they said, well, you know that famous photograph of Ansel Adams, the one he took in 1950 something or other, that beautiful photograph of Denali, that's exactly the spot he was standing in when he took the photograph. You've sat in exactly the same spot. And I thought, in all the hundreds of square miles I could have chosen to sit in to paint Denali, he and I had chosen exactly the same spot. And I thought that was rather affirming, I must say, because he's obviously one of the world's great photographers. And he's certainly got an eye for a landscape. And here, the souvenirs here are sort of a pun in a way, in that I say to people, well, that's everything that everybody knows about Alaska. There are grizzly bears, that's a grizzly bear claw, and everybody knows about grizzly bears. There's oil in this vial here, there's gold in this vial here, and then there's a little twig here that I found that looks exactly like a rifle. And I thought, well, that's Sarah Palin. Everybody knows about Sarah Palin. So those are the souvenirs which all are associated with Denali. This painting I'm immensely proud of. It's the biggest painting I've ever done on site. Of course, all my paintings are done on site, and about 2/3 finished on site. And this one was really a Herculean effort. I had to have a 7-foot by 4-foot drawing board propped up right on the edge of the canyon, as you can see, right on the edge. And I had to find a site which was private, quiet, and going to be left alone. And I sat there day after day after day painting, 21 days before I felt it was sufficiently resolved to roll it up and bring it to back to my studio in Cornwall to finish. So I suppose on site I finished pretty well everything, all the way down here and up here. That was all done. And then everything else was drawn. So I think it took about 4 or 5 days just to do the drawing, let alone to start painting. And then this area here, I generally, when I'm working on this kind of painting, the foreground is the last thing that gets painted because it has to contrast with everything else to give you that sense of, you know, that you're sitting right on the edge of an abyss. And this painting, although it doesn't have really a nominee as such, was done as an homage or a homage to my great friend Bill Brace, William Brace, Dr. William Brace, who was the director of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at MIT. And he died, I think, about 12 years ago now. But he first took me to the Grand Canyon, and he and I spent many months in the Grand Canyon together, hiked miles and miles of it. We hiked, I think, about 400 miles of the canyon, mostly at this level here, what they call the Tonto level, which goes on for miles and miles and miles. I learned so much about the Grand Canyon simply by being with one of the world's greatest geologists. And we hiked lots of other places too, but the canyon was his favorite place, and it became my favorite place too. So that's a homage to my friend. This little series here is, of course, a journey down the Colorado River. I've actually done 3 Colorado journeys. I've rafted the Colorado 3 times. And in this case, I was rafting with someone who became a friend, who has rafted the Colorado every year without missing a single year. He's rafted it every year for 52 years. And he's a marvelous person. And he invited me to go with him. He puts together a group of people he thinks will enjoy themselves, and he invited me to come. So of course, I'm never going to turn down a trip down the Colorado. And so my job really was to do a painting every day, which I did for this series. And one particular painting, I know the canyon fairly well, and in fact I've painted this same painting from the same spot for 6 times. Altogether I've hiked down from the top 3 times, and I've rafted the Colorado 3 times, and each time we've camped on Boucher Beach, and I've done that same painting. So I'm familiar with a lot of these places, but that doesn't in any way diminish the excitement and the interest and the majesty and the magic of the Grand Canyon, which I love very much. This is Mont Blanc in the Alps, of course. I was invited to go and paint by a French TV company who were doing a program called Artistes en haut, in other words, artists on high, and about artists who paint high mountains or high in the mountains. And I said, well, if I'm going to come, I'm very particular about where I actually find my sites. And so if you wouldn't mind paying for an extra week so I can come ahead of time, spend a week poking around in the Alps until I find something that really works, that'll save everybody a lot of time, because otherwise your cameraman is going to be following me around and I'm just going to keep going to places going, no, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. So let me go first, I'll find somewhere, and then you can arrive with all your equipment and do the filming. So that's what we did, and I found this marvelous, marvelous place, absolutely perfect. Here's Mont Blanc, obviously the summit. But the good thing about it is that it's got all these fantastic diagonals which lead your eye right into the picture. And it's even got these, just a perfect little eye catcher here, a nice little waterfall. Everything about it is exactly right for a big painting, because it's all very well to go to all these places and think you can make a big painting, but the subject has to be exactly right. You can't just go anywhere and make a big painting. You have to really hunt hard to find the right place. And I always make a point of doing that. And not only was it spectacularly good as far as the actual structure of the thing is concerned, but also the meadows were absolutely full of the most gloriously beautiful wildflowers you've ever seen. And so the subject of this work is beauty, and what could be more beautiful than that? So, and I did this little study along here, just of the flowers themselves and how absolutely magical they are. And the nominee for this in the end turned out to be someone who's become a friend called Lionel Vibo. And Lionel is the senior Chamonix guide, and he has a person of enormous stature around Chamonix, because to become a Chamonix guide you have to really know what you're doing. And he too is a painter. And so we sat together painting every day, and Lionel and I became good friends. And when we would go into a restaurant together in the evening in Chamonix, everybody would say, "How do you know Lionel? You know, he's the superstar around here." So I felt I was in very good company, and he became the person who nominated that lovely site. I then went to Borneo. Luckily for me, Borneo was nominated by 2 of my luminaries. One of them, Robin Hanby-Tennyson, who's an explorer, who's a friend, and the other, Professor Sir Gillian Prance, who was director of the New York Botanical Garden, I think certainly director of Kew Gardens in London, a huge authority on tropical plants, tropical rainforests, one of the world's great authorities. And has also become a friend. And so, luckily for me, they both suggested Borneo, which meant I could sort of kill 2 birds with one stone. This particular painting here I'm inside a cave here called the Deer Cave, and this cave was reckoned, until very recently, reckoned to be the largest cave in the world. They say that you could pile St. Paul's Cathedral one on top of the other 3 times before it would reach the top. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't suppose anybody's ever tried, but it's certainly an immense cave. And as you look out of it, what struck me was you see this fantastic hill or mountain really here, just as if it's been turned out of a jelly mold and covered in tropical vegetation, absolutely exquisite. And these sago palms here give a kind of lovely glittering light to the thing. And you're sitting in this dank, dark cave looking out at this marvelous thing. And so the reason I chose this was because Robin Hanby-Tennyson went to Borneo in the 80s to set up a scientific research station in untouched rainforest. And he set up a research station near here, and he claims, and I'm sure it's true, that he was the first European ever to go into this cave. And you can actually crawl through or climb through it, wander through it. You have to go over piles and piles of bat guano, and it stinks like anything. But you can then emerge to the other side, and I did do this, and you emerge into somewhere that looks like it's never ever been touched before. It's just marvelous. A stream running like this with huge fish in it like this, which take no notice of you whatsoever. I went and sat in the stream with the fish, and they didn't disappear, they didn't bolt away, they just carried on swimming around and took no notice, because nobody's ever tried to catch them, because nobody ever goes there. And it was just a magic place, but it did involve scrambling across a lot of bat guano and sliding around, and it's pretty filthy stuff. And so I decided I wouldn't paint that side of it, I'd paint this side, which was much simpler. This cave is the home to 3 million wrinkled lip bats, and the wrinkled lip bats at dusk, they all swarm, and they make these beautiful shapes like birds do sometimes. If you get a flock of birds, big flock of birds, the bats did the same thing, and they would circle around in these wonderful sinuous shapes until they found their direction, and off they would go. And the scientists had discovered that they eat 20 tons of insects a night. Now, I can't imagine what 20 tons of insects look like, but it must be an enormous amount. And so good for them, I reckon. But the disadvantage with sitting in the cave, of course, to work, is that they then crap 10 tons of guano every night too, and the smell of that was just appalling. And so I was always pleased to be able to get out when my day was finished and go back to where I was. They'd lent me a nice little wooden house to live in, and I was living in this little wooden house. I couldn't wait to get back there every evening because of the stink of sitting in that cave all day. But anyway, a beautiful view from the entrance. And then this one here, in fact, this photograph here, you can see Foster himself working on this painting, looking slightly perplexed, wondering what the heck to do next. And so this was the painting really I did for Professor Gillian Prance, because what he said about the Borneo rainforest was they have the most spectacular, the tallest and the best buttress trees. And so I thought I would better do a painting of buttress trees for Gillian, and so that's the painting I did for him. Now, this is something of an oddity, really. I'll admit that. It's a strange thing that I'm doing here. Sir David Attenborough, when I first asked him if he would nominate somewhere, he always writes nice letters, David Attenborough, handwritten, lovely letters, and he wrote, said, "Dear Tony, I'm very flattered that you asked me, and I've thought a lot about this, but I've decided I don't want to do it. I don't want to nominate somewhere." And of course I was disappointed, and I thought about it, and I realized, well, of course he doesn't want to nominate somewhere, because if David Attenborough nominates somewhere, it'll immediately be crushed by coachloads of tourists going to David Attenborough's most beautiful place in the world. And so I wrote him a note back saying, Dear David, I quite understand. My hunch is that the reason is that if you nominate somewhere, it'll be destroyed. And so anyway, went quiet for a bit, and then he wrote me another letter saying, I've thought about this, and I've realized that I can happily nominate an underwater coral reefs, because, you know, I'm not going to be specific about it. I'm just going to say that the most magical experience I've ever had in my life was the first time I put on a face mask and diving equipment and went down onto a tropical coral reef. Just the color and the life and the zest of the thing was so wonderful. And so that was perfect. And so what it meant was, of course, that I then had to work out a way of doing paintings underwater, or doing something underwater which I could then turn into paintings. And so I then devised this way of working, which involved working on these sheets of architect's drafting film, which is like a plastic paper with a plastic drawing board, Caran d'Ache crayons, these Swiss crayons, and an extra weight belt. Go and sit on the bottom in about 30 or 40 feet of water and sit and draw the fish and so on. And at first, you know, the fish are quite curious and they come up and sort of look to see what on earth you're doing. But then eventually they get used to you and they go on and get on with their lives, going around the coral reefs. And in fact, they were perfectly good subjects, really. They didn't make a fuss, and I was able to sit for an hour and do drawings underwater. And when I got enough drawings, then I would then make a painting, obviously back on dry land, make a watercolor from my drawings that I'd done. So if you see this fish here, for instance, that's a drawing that I did underwater, and that's the fish there that I did as a painting from it. And these little squirrel fish here, which are common to most coral reefs, delightful little spry things. And so I'm fairly familiar with most of these fish because I've been a scuba diver for many years. And so I simply adapted my scuba diving practice to doing underwater drawings. And this fish here, this is from off Little Cayman. This fish here is a grouper, and the groupers, a big grouper, this one, about that size, and grouper congregate here to breed at a certain time of the year, and it must have been about this time, because this grouper, there were lots of grouper about, and this one kept coming up to me and nudging me where I sat. He would come up and brush against me and nudge me, and I often wondered whether in fact it wanted to breed with me, or whether it wanted me to clear off so that it could carry on breeding with somebody else. But if you look on these drawings, you'll see little notes and things about the fish, and then I simply adapt those to make the final paintings. This one was done in the Maldives, and you can see I've done 2 or 3 little sketches here, or 2 little sketches. And there again, this is called a trevally jack, which is a very, very fast predatory fish. The interesting thing was it stayed exactly where it was in the water, looking at me for quite a long time, and then a snorkeler snorkeled across the surface, and the snorkeler's shadow was thrown across the fish, and the fish darted off at huge speed, just like lightning. And then when the snorkeler, moved on, the fish came back again and stayed in exactly the same place again, just staring at me. And I thought, what an extraordinary thing, because it was just obviously curious about what the heck I was doing. So perhaps it was become an art lover, who knows? Now, being, what can I say, a sensible married man, I thought, well, if I thought I better at least ask Anne what she thinks, my wife Anne, I thought I better at least ask her what she thinks is the most beautiful place in the world. And she said, I think the most beautiful thing I've ever seen is the sunsets in the Maldives. So I thought, oh no, that means we've got to go back to the Maldives, and I'm going to have to paint all those sunsets in a beautiful tropical paradise. Won't that be terrible? And so I did this series of paintings, actually from 2 different islands, of sunsets in the Maldives. I've got to say that as an artist, if you're caught doing pictures of sunsets, that's the death of your career. You might just as well pack up and go and do something else, because contemporary art cannot stand the idea that somebody might paint a sunset. It's just completely anathema. And so I'm taking a huge risk. These are the riskiest paintings in this entire exhibition. Because, of course, my entire career hangs on the fact that I'm hoping that just by doing honest paintings, as honest as I can make them, about what I actually saw, people will forgive me for what are, after all, quite romantic things. But my wife wrote a beautiful piece in the catalogue about why these were so beautiful. And as she says, even the most hardened skeptic put the gin and tonic in their hand and sit them down at 6:20 in the Maldives, and you can bet that they will be compelled to watch the beauty of the sunset, even against their better instincts. Another of my nominees, Stephen Venables, Britain's greatest climber, or at least, I don't know, he may not be now, but he certainly was at the time. Most extraordinary man who climbed, this is the east face of Everest, which very few people have ever seen, let alone, and as far as I know, nobody's ever painted it. And in fact, I'm the only person who's ever painted all three faces of Everest, because if you look down on Everest, it's basically triangular. So I painted the north face, the southwest face, and the east face. And as I say, very few people have ever seen it because it's very, very hard to get to. And once you get to it, if you're a climber, it's also nearly impossible to climb. Well, Stephen, he climbs without oxygen. So he climbed the summit. He had 4 companions with him, but they all dropped out one by one. And so he soloed to the summit. He got there too late in the day. And so he had to come down 500 feet and cut a snow seat and sit in it all night with no oxygen, and then find his way back down over the period of the next couple of weeks. And so that was the most heroic kind of endeavor, I mean, foolhardy to say the least, but heroic certainly. And so when I asked him what's the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, he said the Karma Valley leading to the east face. And so, okay, so we had to go to Tibet, get yak drivers, Sherpas, porters, a cook, and we had to make our way. Actually, the yak drivers were very reluctant because we were the first people that year to try and get to the east face, and the yaks were going through. We had to go ahead of the yaks and break the snow to make a path for the yaks to get up, because loaded yaks going up steep places, if they trap their feet between rocks, which they can't see, they're quite likely to break their leg, and then that's the end of it. And the Tibetans, of course, all they have is their yaks, and so they were reluctant to do it. But we said if we go first, and so that's what happened. And we turned up with this view here, just above where we were camping, and it was pretty dreadful because the weather was just awful. As you can see from here, the weather was just storms coming in all the time, swirling around, and I never ever saw this entire scene all in one go. I would see this bit here, the clouds would part to reveal this, I'd draw that and paint a bit of it, and then that would be obliterated, and I might see that, and then I'd paint that, and I might then see that, and then paint that, and so on. This would all be, mists and swirling around, and it was hopeless, really. And I only saw Everest for a very short time, probably 20 minutes or half an hour at the most, I think. But anyway, I quickly put it in and hoping that it was in the right place, because by then I couldn't see anything else. And so when Stephen came to the opening of the exhibition in London at the Royal Watercolour Society, he stood in front of the painting for a very long time. And so I went over and I thought, oh gosh, he's just kind of trying to rearrange it so it makes more sense. He's trying to think, what's wrong with that? Why isn't that moved over further or something? Anyway, he came, and I went upstairs and said, what do you think, Stephen? And he said, Tony, it brings it back exactly to me. He said, I know exactly where you were sitting. And so I thought that was just a great pat on the back for me for having actually got the darn thing in the right place. And this little painting here, which a lot of people love, is simply all I could do when I was stuck in my tent for 3 days in a blizzard, while waiting for the weather to clear so I could do that painting. And all I could see out of my tent flap was this little bit of rock here, a nondescript piece of rock, and with snow coming belting down the whole time. And I just sat and did that out of boredom, really, because I'd read my books, I didn't know what else to do. So I thought, I'll do a little painting. So I did that, and everybody loves it. In fact, somebody came up to me the other night and said, do you know which one I like best? That one of the snow, where you're looking out of your tent flap. So it's a very popular painting for some reason. I don't know why, but perhaps people just feel it feels like, you know, real hardship looking out at that for 3 days. This too is in the Himalayas. This is Machapuchare, and if you were to take a vote of the most beautiful mountain in the world, Machapuchare would come pretty high up in the list, I think, because it comes to a very satisfactory point. It's never been climbed, or at least it's never been summited, because it's sacred to the Hindus. They believe it's the resting place of Hindu gods, and so out of respect, climbers have never summited. And interestingly, as I understand it, the valleys are sacred to the Buddhists and the mountaintop is sacred to the Hindus. So, this is a painting of Machapuchare, nominated by my great friends, the explorers and intrepid travellers, Bill and Annie Vanderbilt. They said that they've never forgotten their first view of Machapuchare. It took their breath away. And so I sat and did this painting here with the help of my cook, Ram, who actually found the site in the end. I was poking around looking for a site, couldn't find one. And he slipped down a steep little, off the path. He slipped down and fell through a lot of bamboo and bracken and stuff. And then when he stood up, he said, "Tony, I think I found it." And I went down and there, sure enough, there was exactly the right spot. With a nice, just a nice arrangement of vegetation here and a good view and a little path going through here. And so Ram, my cook, he found that for me and was very proud of himself. And these are Hindu, with the Hindu colour. They have a colour festival every year where they throw coloured powder over everybody, all over each other. Everybody emerges looking absolutely wonderful, covered in colour. And so I bought lots of vials of the colour that they throw over each other, and each vial or each colour has got a symbolism in the Hindu culture, and so there's a little label just describing what the symbolism is of each colour, because I thought that was an important point. But so that painting is the major painting of Machapuchare, and these three are a little set of paintings, well, not little, but a set of paintings sort of on the way to paint that picture, or at least that was the major picture that I was doing. And so this is really one of the early sightings of Machapuchare. And then, as you can see here, you have to go up and down these ridges. All these ridges are separate and enormously steep, sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 feet deep. And you have to go down and up and down and up and down and up and down and up, remorselessly on your way to Annapurna, and so we went to Annapurna in order to get another view of Machapuchare, and so this is what you get when you get down to the bottom of the ravines. You get a beautiful rushing glacier stream from the melted glacier or melted snow, and monkeys, lots of monkeys playing in the trees here. Absolutely beautiful, sort of subtropical almost compared to the high country. And certainly compared to this, which is from Annapurna Base Camp, and that's the view of Machapuchare from Annapurna Base Camp. And I'm proud of that painting because it wasn't the most comfortable place to sit and work, I've got to say, and difficult to get to, pretty rugged, but just a painting. I absolutely love that painting. It's really nice. I shouldn't say that, should I? But anyway, it is. We're back in the UK now. My great friend John Hawkes, who used to be UK chairman of Friends of the Earth, then he ran a gallery, then he became a parish priest, a much loved parish priest, and he's been a friend for many, many years. And so I thought, as ex-chairman of Friends of the Earth UK, he had a certain status, and I asked him to be a luminary, and he nominated this place, Wistman's Wood, which is on Dartmoor. I hadn't actually ever been there before. I'd heard of it, but never been. And it is a magical kind of place, and it has the reputation for being what they call pixie-led. In other words, you're quite likely to get lost there because the elves and pixies are going to put you on the wrong path. And sure enough, it is a very complicated place. And I poked around for quite a while before I could find something that would make a painting. You'd think, well, rocks and trees, you know, what's so difficult about that? But just getting something that would make a big painting was quite tricky. But anyway, I sat perfectly happily, I think, for 4 days working on this painting. And then, as the souvenirs, I did this, just a set of studies of little oak leaves in various states of decay. And as you can see, it's autumn, so all the oak leaves are turned brown. And so that's really just a very simple, in a way, a very simple painting. But I do like it has got the kind of slightly magical quality that, you know, you expect. In fact, at one point I was thinking of drawing a few fairies in here, because you think the fairies ought to really be flitting around in this misty light as you look through the trees, through these ancient trees. Okay, now we're in Chile. I had 2 nominations for this too. One was Professor Luis Ruiz, who is an astronomer from Santiago University, or attached to Santiago University, and one of the world's great astronomers. And she suggested, of course, that the Atacama Desert was a jolly good place because it's dry, it's very high. Up in the Andes, above the Atacama, the sky is clear, so it's ideal for astronomy, although the air is a bit thin when you get up to 16,000 feet. But nonetheless, the air is very, very clear, and it's cold, and there's no moisture, because in some places in the Atacama it hasn't rained for 150 years. So it's about the driest place you could ever find. And so she suggested the Atacama, and then also my friend Professor Stephen Sparks, who's one of the world's great volcanologists, who I've worked with a few times when I was doing my volcano series, he suggested Parinacota, which is a volcano which is in Bolivia and Chile. And so that was 2 reasons to go to Chile. And so the first part of that, when we were on our way to Parinacota up in the Andes, we started off. This by the way is the Atacama. As you can see, this is a lovely. The colour in the Atacama, most of the Atacama actually is rather dull. It's a kind of dull grey and not very inspiring and pretty grim, in fact. But there are parts of it which are just exquisite, and so somewhere like this, where you get these fantastic colours, this lovely salt pan here, which is this gleaming white against all these fantastic ochres and browns and so on, reds, and then as you go into the distance, it goes blue. Just extraordinarily beautiful, I thought. So I did that painting. This here is a little mountain called Conquer Boar, and when I was in Bolivia a few years before, in fact, that always haunted me, this mountain, because it's 19,500 feet, and we went to climb it one day, got up about 4:30 in the morning and started to climb it. I was with Bill Vanderbilt and some other friends, and what we wanted to do was get to the top, where there's a lake at the top, apparently, with a little island in it, and they say that the Incas used to do a lot of, leave a lot of offerings and so on there. We wanted to just see this extraordinary thing. Anyway, so we got up to 18,500, or about 18,000 feet, and I said to Bill, "Hey Bill, isn't it time for a tea break?" And he said, "No, Tony, let's keep on pressing on to the top." And I said, "Well, surely it's tea break by now." And he said, No, come on, keep going. Anyway, 500 feet later, I passed out. And I've always said to Bill, or Bill's always said to me, "I'm never going to deny you a tea break ever again," because I passed out and came to lying down, and them all kind of peering at me thinking, "Oh my God, he's died." And then I had no choice really but to stumble back down. And because they're good friends, they came back down with me. So I always feel guilty that they never ever got to the top because I passed out. And in fact, I've subsequently found that 18,500 feet is about my altitude level as far as I can go without oxygen. And so these little paintings here really are the story of our trip along the coast, going north, and then getting back into the Andes again here, and then up into the upper Atacama. And this little painting here I say that I never do paintings from photographs, and I never do, except in this case I did. It was so bitterly cold there up at, I think that's up at about 16,000 feet above the Atacama. And in fact, I took a photograph of this and did this work from photograph. And I put in a little piece of a meteorite here because of course the sky is so extraordinarily full of stars in the Atacama. But I will confess that one was done from a photograph. When Stephen Sparks said Periwinkle he thought the most beautiful volcano in the world, I said, well, Steve, could you suggest another one? Because I've already painted that one. And he said, which side did you paint it from? And I said, oh, Bolivia. He said, oh, no, I'm talking about Chile. So that meant I had to go all the way back to Chile in order to paint the other side of this mountain, which I painted, I don't know, 15 years before, I think. But anyway, I was pleased I did because, of course, on the Chilean side, you've got this wonderful lake, which absolutely reflects this perfect cone volcano. And so it seemed to me to be a marvelous sight. I must admit it was a bit grim painting it because it's pretty harsh up there, and bitterly cold at night. I was camping, and I would have a gallon of water with me, which would freeze absolutely as solid as a rock every night. And then in the morning I'd have to try and chip bits out of it in order to make my morning cup of tea. But then by midday it was belting hot. It was just furiously hot, and you'd feel as if your brain was frying. And then a storm would come in about 2 o'clock every afternoon or 3 o'clock, and usually hailstorm or sometimes snow, and it would start. I'd get back into my tent. I'd wait there until the storm had passed over. I'd get back out again. It'd be wet and cold by this time. I'd do another hour's work, and then I'd crawl into my sleeping bag and spend the rest of the night waiting really for the morning. But what was nice about it was that this wonderful foreground of these lovely yellow ochre rocks and these strange little plants here, and the lake itself was full of flamingos, absolutely beautiful. So these are studies of flamingo feathers here. So that was lovely. And this little painting here is to prove that I actually did go and paint the other side of it from the Bolivian side. This was done in 1997. So let's think, I don't know, 15 years before I did that one. And so funnily enough, I still had that painting left over from the exhibition that I did about volcanoes. Lastly, I thought it'd be nice to end on a kind of nice sparkling, cheery kind of painting after that very bleak painting of Periwinkle. And this, of course, as you will all perfectly well know, is the autumn colour in New England. My friend Peggy Brace, who's a great environmentalist and the widow of my friend Bill Brace, she said, "You've never painted the autumn colour. It's time you did." So I said, "Okay, I'll come and paint it." And in a way, this is coming full circle for me, because my first exhibition in the States was about Henry Thoreau, and I went and painted Walden Pond and the Conquer River and so on. And this, in fact, is on the Conquer River. So this is 38 years later, or 35 years later, I'm back in Concord, painting by the Concord River, and just breathtakingly beautiful, the autumn colour, and nearly drove me insane painting it, because with the watercolours, you can't paint, if you want to keep your colour bright, you can't paint it over anything. It's the paper, it's the white paper that provides the brightness. And so if you want a nice bright yellow or a nice bright orange, you can't paint that over anything. So that means you have to paint round it. You have to paint the sky round the yellow and round the orange, instead of, if it was an oil painting, you'd paint the sky and then you'd paint the leaves over the top of it. But with the watercolour, you can't do that if you want it to sparkle. So it very painstaking doing this painting, and I can remember I did a huge chunk of it, about 10 days on site, and then took it home, and I would be working on it in my studio, and I'd come down and I'd say, "God, I've only done another 6 square inches. It's driving me insane, this picture." But anyway, luckily, by the end, I looked at it, I thought, well, it's all worth it, because it is a sparklingly cheerful and beautiful thing. And then, of course, this is simply about time passing. This is the leaves turning from green through to yellow, orange, red, and an almost purpley red. Just exquisitely beautiful. and I sat and did that whole series of studies in a little hut that somebody lent me for the weekend. And this, lastly, the Connecticut River, where my brother and I were in a canoe, and we were actually looking for a site for a big painting about autumn colour, and we never really found one. And so I ended up just doing these three little pictures, one each day, and then we gave up on the Connecticut River and then went to Concord instead, and I did that painting. So that's the record of a 3-day journey down the Connecticut River. And so that's the last painting of the series. I hope what I've demonstrated is that it's not an idle thing to try and make works which are beautiful, and which people, I hope, will come and enjoy and feel uplifting and say something about the extraordinary beauty of the planet that we all inhabit. Thank you.